Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vice President, Research and Development, Cloud Native Apps, VMware, Craig McLuckie.
All right, folks, good afternoon. It's going to be interesting to see my voice holds up, so you just have to bear with me if it gets a little dim as we progress. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to spend some time with you here. It's been a fascinating journey for me over the last 10 months. So I recently joined VMware as part of an acquisition, and I've historically been a pretty significant part of the open source and Kubernetes community. It's something that I've tracked acutely for the last little while. And before I jump in here, I just want to introduce some of my co-speakers that will show up during the session. I'm going to be joined by a friend of mine, James Waters from Pivotal. We've been working together for some time, and obviously, one of the exciting things that's happening in the ecosystem is that we announced our intent to acquire Pivotal. I'll be joined by another friend, Daniel, who I've known for quite some time, who's been part of Bitnami, who recently joined VMware, and we'll be talking about some sort of interesting opportunities as we bring these communities together. And then Christian is going to be joining us as well from Swisscom, who's going to be providing a little bit of customer insight into what it feels like to be on this journey together. And then finally, Aaron, who works on my product management team, will be talking through some of the scale-out management capabilities that we're introducing into the platform. So to kick it off, how many of you have obviously heard the word Tanzu? It's something that we've been pretty proud of for a while. And when I reflect on my own kind of career journey, I think it's really kind of marked by sort of two distinct phases. And I think this is pretty true of a lot of different people out there in the world, right? The first part of my life was about getting code into production, right? And it was too darn hard. It was a constant exercise of pain and work. And I found myself in a situation where I used to actually develop code, for reals and anger. I was spending an inordinate portion of my life not actually writing code, right? I spent a lot of my life just wrestling with infrastructure, dealing with the mechanics of how to progress my world. And then I spent the second half of my life trying to figure out how to make people that used to do my job be better at it, right? And I think that's also true of a lot of folks as they progress on their career journey. My journey took me down the path of, not just focusing on that at the sort of team-based level of how to make my individual developers more productive, but also thinking about it a little bit more holistically. So as part of my work, I've worked on API-driven infrastructure with projects like Google Compute Engine. I was one of the founders of the Kubernetes project, which was an attempt to kind of produce a much more progressive way of looking at the world, to run on relatively traditional infrastructure environments. But at the end of the day, what we've done is necessary, but it's still insufficient. It's still too hard to ultimately get code into production for everyday developers. We have a lot of additional work to do to advance the state of the art. And to do that, we have to kind of enrich our thinking a little bit, which is where VMware Tanzu comes in. When I look at what Tanzu is, it's a portfolio of platform technologies and services that are intended to help organizations get code into production quicker. And we're coming at that really from two sides. Answering the question of what does an ideal infrastructure environment look like? How can we construct an infrastructure environment that ultimately satisfies the needs of developers? And then from the other side of the building the bridge from the other side of the river, what can we do from an infrastructure, from a developer platform perspective, to ultimately make more and better leveraged use of these new emerging infrastructure technologies? So Tanzu as a word means a couple of things. It's an homage to containers, so it's a word for container-based cabinetry coming out of Japan. It's also the Swahili word for tree branches, right? Like a new direction for VMware. We intend this to be a bold and significant push over the next future. You'll be hearing a lot more about Tanzu. But at the end of the day, it's also about constructing the mechanisms that bridge the world of people structure, the individuals that are ultimately constructing applications with the tools that they're using to build these applications that are powering modern businesses, with the underlying infrastructure that those technologies run on. So we look at Tanzu as being an all-in play from VMware to really kind of bring those two worlds together. And when we start thinking about what these kind of critical ingredients are, I tend to think about it as cut across three lines. And again, you're going to hear a lot more from us about these three things, right? A lot of our journey starts with Kubernetes. When you look at the origins of Kubernetes and our original intent behind constructing that platform, we really wanted to create this Goldilocks abstraction. The idea that we could create something that was low enough level that you could run pretty much any workload on it, but high enough level that it would hide away the specifics of that infrastructure. And in doing that, it would decouple you from the environment. You could make more practical choices about where you wanted to run an application. As you were dealing with this world where portions of your application portfolio have to run on premises and portions of those applications have to run in cloud, Kubernetes became a very natural technology. But the important thing here, as we think about how it relates to Tanzu, is that enterprise word, right? It's not enough to just deliver an open source technology. When you look at modern enterprises, they're complex. They have a lot of challenges with regulatory and compliance issues. They're dealing with the mechanics of operations at scale, and that becomes increasingly challenging for organizations. So our commitment from the VMware perspective is to continue to progress the open source agenda, to make Kubernetes as an upstream technology not just more consumable, but far more intrinsically enterprise friendly. Now, one of the interesting challenges that you'll start to encounter as you bring Kubernetes into your environment is you're probably not just bringing one piece of technology. You really need to start thinking about it as something that is consumed in a significant amount of scale. And at the end of the day, you have to have the ability to reason both about the experience for your operators and what efficiencies you can create for your operators that are deploying and running large numbers of Kubernetes clusters, but also create an accessible set of interfaces that give your development teams access to this new class of infrastructure, that really enable you to move in this world from development, from static infrastructure, ticket-driven provisioning, into a much more progressive cloud-like API-driven provisioning and consumption model. And then ultimately, it's not enough to stop there. You also need to think through what it takes to populate those clusters with your applications. Having a really credible and robust story of how to take something that you already have, make the minimal amount of investment necessary to achieve a high return of investment as it progresses into this more progressive infrastructure. How to start making investments in how your teams are operating so they can get the best benefits out of the underlying infrastructure itself. And so that part of the stack that we consider build is incredibly important. And as folks have probably heard, we do intend to acquire Pivotal, which I think brings a tremendous amount of capabilities to the market that address these issues. So with that, I'd like to invite my friend James on stage to talk a little bit about some of the innovations that are happening in that area.
Great. Thanks so much,
James.
Craig. Y'all excited about Tanzu? Raise your hand if you're excited about Tanzu. I couldn't be more excited about Tanzu. I've had the pleasure for the last 2 days of basically intensively whiteboarding this for customers one-on-one. And the idea that we can now have a ubiquitous multi-cloud Kubernetes substrate that also has the best-in-class developer experiences that are secure, all built for enterprises. It actually is just activating people, and I feel like I'm making friends in these meetings. And I got an invite to come to Prague this morning, where I've never been, to do a deeper dive on Tanzu. So that's really exciting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what Pivotal is bringing to this build section of Tanzu. And I think Pivotal can make some material contributions to you. I'll describe those. A little bit about how people are dealing with, once they get the early success with developers, how they start to take on their legacy, because that's a huge thing. Every enterprise has heritage applications. And then finally, a little bit about how we're refactoring some parts of our platform to be even more conformant with where Tanzu is going. Huge bets on Kubernetes coming. But I'm going to start a little bit with, I think one of the remarkable things about the platform that we've been working on for enterprise developers has been its outcomes. At a large insurance company, before they adopted the Pivotal platform, they told me they might have gotten to 2 releases a year for their dev teams. And after adopting the Pivotal platform, and as Craig said, using a software supply chain based on APIs, not on tickets, they're now doing about 10 releases a month. And this hasn't been some giant consultant from McKinsey driven change and a lot of meetings about it. They've literally just given their development teams on their LOBs these APIs to deploy applications. And they've really 10x'd or more the amount of deployments they're able to make for their business. So really, API-driven developer interfaces have been a total game changer in our clients. And this is the largest insurance company in America. It's a very conservative client. The other thing that's happened is as you get this secure enterprise software supply chain, You give the developers a great experience of an API, but suddenly IT really controls everything that's going into the infrastructure. Have you had any concerns as, hey, as we're going to containers, how do we know what's in them? Has anyone in the audience had that concern? Hey, the devs are deploying containers, what's in them? Raise your hand if you have, and if not, you might soon. The great thing about the Pivotal platform is we've built this more automated set of technologies that we call build packs. And what build packs do is they algorithmically determine, based on the application artifact, how the container should be built. And so they make it easier for the developer. The developer says, here's my application, please give me a running container in production, working for it. And they also give security unparalleled leverage over knowing everything that's happening in the system at all times. And we have major banks that use this holistic approach to infrastructure to rebuild every day and to be secure every day. Is anyone in the audience able to patch their entire platform every day? Right? That's so the two people that raised their hands. I really want to see the details. That's great work. But what happens is you have this more automated approach of an integrated software supply chain based on APIs. The system knows everything that's inside of it, and it knows what's compatible for upgrades, and we're able to upgrade the entire system and get unparalleled security. So I think that's a really exciting thing about Tanzu Build is we're bringing developer APIs for productivity, while at the same time giving you unheard of security improvements around patching and control. The other thing that we have at Pivotal to enable this is the #1 enterprise productivity platform for Java developers. It's called Spring. And there's a very ubiquitous technology called Spring Boot. And if anyone has dealt with Oracle WebLogic or IBM WebSphere in their environment, raise your hand if you've ever had any of that. It was sort of built for the era of deploy once a year. It has a ton of knobs on it, and it's built to be a heavyweight, slow-moving thing. Well, we came along and invented this new technology called Spring Boot, that as the developer writes the app, it auto-configures, once again, the entire Java environment, just lets you deploy that to production. That is so popular right now that every 2 seconds, a new developer somewhere in the world starts a Spring Boot project. And we're building everything around Tanzu to be highly compatible with that #1 framework in the world for developers. So pretty excited about that. Does that sound good to people? If not, slow me down, because I am going after that. I'm pretty excited about it. The other question that happens is, you see these great results. We had one client that told me over dinner, I've cut the operations overhead on a couple of our major applications from 500 outsourced people that we were struggling to keep this application in production down to a team on the platform of 6. And I kind of looked up from my steak. I was like, did you just say that? Is that real? I wouldn't believe it if the customer hadn't told me this unprompted. But that's the level of automation that we bring. But what happens then is they say, well, what do I do about the rest of my estate that isn't this semi-new or modern applications? And so Pivotal has developed an application transformation practice called AppTX, which allows you to take existing applications to create CI/CD pipelines for them, to containerize them, and to bring this bold new world of declarative infrastructure that Craig and team have really innovated on to build Kubernetes to your entire application estate. And so there's a tremendous 1-2 punch of enable your developers with the latest and greatest and modern frameworks and technology, as well as saying, how can Pivotal and now the Tanzu team come in and help me get everything in my legacy into a pipeline, into a container? And I really think that's the journey over the next several years. I met with one really inspired telco in Europe this morning, and they said, we want everything that we do as a telco to be declarative. We want everything into a pipeline. And I think that's a very exciting vision of Tanzu, is everything can be in a declarative, containerized pipeline. So I think that's pretty exciting. So to get there, we're bringing everything that Pivotal does to Kubernetes. So we already have a beta support of Kubernetes on our platform. And as part of Tanzu, everything that you get from Kubernetes, from Pivotal, will be in the Tanzu Kubernetes run environment. And so, just to close, we have the best in developer-driven APIs that are secure for enterprises and software supply chain, transformation and consulting organization to bring you to containerization and CI/CD. And then finally, we're going to get a huge acceleration in our R&D because we're able to take advantage of that Tanzu Run substrate and the Tanzu Mission Control, which you'll hear more about very soon in terms of how you operate everything from Pivotal. So I'm super excited about the Tanzu roadmap and all the Pivotal technologies coming to that Kubernetes Run substrate. So thank you for your support. The next question then is, okay, so this is everything for custom developed software. How do we bring in ISVs from the open source community and allow them to participate in this Tanzu grid? And that's where Daniel, who's going to come up next from Bitnami, has some pretty inspired thinking about how they've worked with open source ISVs to containerize them into a secure software supply chain. Daniel?
Thank you, James. Happy to be here, happy to be part now of the VMware family. Great engineering culture and great vision that we're happy to push forward. And as James and Craig have mentioned before, a lot of the focus is on applications, and most of the companies rather have their developers working on their code and working on adding value to the core products of the company and not things that are around it. And increasingly, a lot of creating applications is not just writing the code, is curating and managing all the third-party dependencies. A lot of those third-party dependencies are open source software, databases, language runtimes, and this is what we're really good at Bitnami, what we have been working on for the last decade. We have millions of developers in the Bitnami platform that run our applications, or the open source applications that we package across all these different cloud vendors, Kubernetes variations, and the more that you look into that, the more that, as Craig mentioned, software development it starts resembling software supply chain in which you combine your own code with third-party, open source, and commercial implementations. We're happy to announce Project Galleon. Pat talked about it in the keynote yesterday. This is the next step in the evolution of Bitnami. We take the Bitnami catalog that developers love and know, and we allow you now to customize this to the requirements of the different enterprises. So you can start with the applications, and then you can select the operating system of your choice. Many companies have golden images or certified operating systems that they trust. You can combine that operating system with our applications. You can add your own monitoring agents. You can add your own opinions and configurations. And then you can publish this to private repositories that then your developers can self-service from. What this makes possible is for the developers to continue to be happy. You can have like happy development teams that can get their job done with without minimal configuration of all these dependencies, but at the same time keeping IT operations and keeping the people who are going to have to support these deployments and who care about compliance, security, and basically the guys who are going to get paid at 3 a.m. to fix this, they can sleep at night knowing that everything has been secure, is continuously maintained, and kept up to date. And we're not doing this alone. We have an enormous amount of partners that are trusting Tanzu, are trusting the work that we're doing at VMware and want to be part of this oral story together. Many of these ISVs are some of the most forward-looking partners and allows you to, when you're building on top of the Tanzu platform, not just take advantage of Bitnami and the open source components that we provide, but a wide variety of commercial and open source components and companies that make that possible to have a trusted software supply chain. And with this, I'm going to leave you with Greg to talk about the run and manage part of Tanzu.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So it's really exciting to see how a company, VMware, that historically the secret's been in our name, right? Like we've been all about VMs, are moving more decisively into the application domain. Bringing together the best of the industry with Bitnami and Pivotal to really provide that intersection between the world that application teams live in and the tools that they use every day to create the highest productive outcomes, with this emerging infrastructure story. And for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to spend some time talking about both the next level of details around how we're structuring the runtime components, and then the work we're doing to tie it all together to really connect that people structure to the infrastructure. But I think to kind of kick off that portion of the conversation, it really makes sense to invite one of our customers up on stage, who's been walking this journey as well, who's really looking at bridging the world of the build technologies into the infrastructure environment and really moving from this infrastructure to an application-centric view of things. So with that, I'd like to, wrong way. Apologies. I'd like to invite Christian, who's the head of cloud product management from Swisscom, on stage to talk a little bit about his experiences, not just with VMware, but also with Pivotal and bringing it all together. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you. Thank you, Craig. I'm proud to stay here also in front of you and talk a little bit about Swisscom's journey and our customers' journey into the modern application world. Before I talk about the customer's journey, just a few words about Swisscom. Swisscom is the biggest telco and IT provider in Switzerland. On our own fiber and mobile networks, we are happy to serve around about 2 million residential customers and around about 300,000 business customers with mobile and telco services. In the cloud area, we are acting on one hand side as a cloud service provider, where we provide managed cloud services and our own private cloud offerings to our customers, and we are also acting as a cloud integrator, where we heavily rely on our strategic partnerships with AWS and Microsoft. Now that's Swisscom. Let's have a look what we see when we talk to our customers. I think most of you know, have gone through the last 5 to 10 years through a journey of getting rid of own virtualization environments and moving into some kind of infrastructure as a service. That's something that, from my point of view, and when we talk to customers, in many customer and IT shops, has happened or is happening today. But I think what we as Swisscom and also our customers have learned on that journey is that this could not be the end, because on one hand side, we have the application developers that are not getting the flexibility and the agility out of these infrastructure services that they want like to do their application development. And on the other hand side, we have the IT operators. They still have to struggle with the complexity of such kind of infrastructure services. So there needs to be something that closes or bridges the gap and coming from infrastructure to application. And that's where containers and especially Kubernetes kicks in. With the containerization, I think we really get to the next level, the next generation of infrastructure, and bridging the gap from the infrastructure to the application. Many of the ISVs are going that path, and we as customers and we as service providers have to follow that path to the application world. But that's not the only challenge. With the step into containerization, a whole new world and ecosystem of microservice-oriented architectures opens up. And microservice-oriented ecosystems like the global public cloud providers, AWS, Microsoft, Google, Ali, all of them are providing a whole ecosystem of microservice-oriented architecture and blueprints. And developers want to use this, want to leverage that. So that's finally the second challenge, how to come from that locally provided, containerized system into a global ecosystem of the multi-cloud provider. And finally, as in technology, nothing happens in a linear sequence. We all together need to find ways to keep that end-to-end under control. Together with VMware and Pivotal, we developed during the last few months and years a container service based on Pivotal Container Services. It's a native Kubernetes service we provide to our customers and really bringing in a element to bridge the gap between the infrastructure and the application. On top of the decision to do that not by our own, but to rely on the Pivotal Container Services was a clear buy decision for us, really to accelerate our time to market in that service. On top of that, we already provide today a massive installation of Cloud Foundry, where we provide PaaS services to our customers and to ourselves. Now, that's here today, managed by Swisscom, but looking forward, what the future could bring. And I think there are several developments, and a few of them we heard already before. One is Tanzu Mission Control, the other one is Bitnami. With Bitnami, we are looking into it to really expand our capabilities, our offering with regards to service richness. And with Tanzu Mission Control, we looking into the step from local to global to leverage the multi-cloud capabilities of the global providers. With that, we are investigating in both of them currently, looking forward to the further developments of VMware Pivotal in that area. Thank you very much, and back to Greg.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right, I'm going to hold the controller up the right way this time, so don't go backwards. Well, hopefully I won't. All right, so let's kind of dig into some of the details here. We've talked a little bit about the world of developers, and we've talked about this idea that we want to bring together the best of a variety of things. You know, the best that Pivotal has to offer, the best that open source communities can construct, and really converge them so that they can support this modern software supply chain that ultimately delivers applications into an ideal infrastructure environment. And for this audience, for the vSphere, folks that have walked this journey with us for a long time, the introduction of Kubernetes represents a really interesting opportunity. It represents an opportunity not just to get more out of your existing investments in vSphere and the technologies associated with it, but to start to expand your reach into new areas and construct an ideal infrastructure program that lets you deliver services in a much more natural way to the business that's dependent on you. So as you're walking the path, as the business pressure emerges of like, how do I become more of a software company? How do I unlock the productivity of my principal asset, which is my developers? We now have a solution that enables us to deliver that more modern infrastructure. And when you start kind of digging into it, I've already said like, hey, we're all in on Kubernetes. I think that message came across pretty loud and clear during the keynotes. But what are the kind of key ingredients that we bring to bear? And how are we thinking about our relationship with the Kubernetes community in a way that is not just going to advance our own interests and our customers' interests, but actually going to ultimately advance the interests of the community itself? And for us, this really starts with a focus on delivering an open source Kubernetes outcome. Increasingly, as we interact with customers, they're concerned about lock-in. There's a lot of different vectors that can generate lock-in. If you're in a specific cloud environment, you may end up getting locked into a specific set of services and capabilities. As you're looking at a sort of discrete vendor, even VMware themselves, or ourselves, you may look at the emergence of this platform as something that's going to lock you in and constrain you. Our vision is not to lock you in. Our vision is to win your custom by continuing to advance and innovate and deliver value to you. And for us, that really starts and ends with the open source community. We're committing significantly to upstream Kubernetes. You will see our contribution rates continue to advance as we bring on more and more engineers that are part of that community. And we're committed to making sure that the rendition of Kubernetes that you consume, whether that's on-prem, in the public cloud, or at the network edge, is consistent with that upstream community's ideals. And that gives you not only access to better choice in terms of the vendors that support you, and we do believe that there's value in choice. We believe that a competitive environment will keep us frosty. It'll keep us on our toes and hopefully deliver better service to you. But it also means that you're able to benefit from this broad ecosystem of tools that emerges. There's a lot of innovation that's happening around Kubernetes, in Kubernetes, on top of Kubernetes. And by staying focused on delivering a solution that innovates at the pace of the community, that's able to bring you the best of that community to the data center that you're running your applications in or to the public cloud, we're going to serve you better. The second thing that I think we have to focus on, and this is, there's sort of two facets to this, is we need to do a better job of making Kubernetes easy to run, period, right? we're obviously invested in doing a better job of making Kubernetes run on vSphere. But I think that constraining your attention to a specific environment leads to this thing I think of as the tragedy of the commons. If you look at a single software vendor and you think about what their interests are to obviously advance the technology to serve their customers, but they're not necessarily motivated to make that technology easier to use in and of itself, right? We're looking at this problem a little differently. We want to deliver you the best possible rendition of Kubernetes on vSphere, but we also want to deliver you the best possible rendition of Kubernetes on AWS and on Google Cloud Compute and on Azure and on Ali Cloud and in a variety of different areas. We're not just incented to operationalize it ourselves, we're incented to help the community operationalize it so that we can mutually benefit from this. And so much of our investments, and a core theme that you'll see as the products that we've produced start to unfold, is that we're committed to not just making it easier to use for ourselves, but in driving the community forwards in a meaningful and substantive way. And then when you start to look at the sort of intersection of these technologies, there's a few things that do tend to stand out. The first and foremost is, hey, how do I bridge the world of build and run? Investments that we've made in technologies like Harbor become increasingly important to our customers as they start thinking about establishing a supply chain that takes applications from a wide range of developers and ISVs and delivers them into potentially a highly globally distributed infrastructure environment. So our investments in technologies like that are further advancing both the community and are serving our customers' needs. And ultimately, everything we produce, we have to be on the line to support. So our commitment to open source also comes with a commitment to your use of open source. We're working very hard to bring as much capabilities as we can into the open source communities that we're betting on. We see this as a symbiotic relationship. By being closer to those communities, we serve those communities better, but we also serve our customers better. So you'll continue to see a high level of investment and a high level of innovation being driven into these open source communities by VMware and by all of the partners that we work with. Now, clicking into the Tanzu story a little bit, you've probably heard a fair bit about Project Pacific. And I'll talk a lot about where that technology is going and what it really means and try to give you a primer on it. But when we think about the challenges our customers face from a macro level, in some ways, that isn't the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem isn't just getting Kubernetes. There's great technologies like Project Pacific that deliver it. The problem is getting Kubernetes everywhere, right? When you think about it, I certainly thought about it this way when I used to work for a cloud provider. Cloud should be a unifying force. It should be a force of consolidation. Why is it that we're seeing the world going the other way right now, right? It's not getting simpler, it's getting harder. We're starting to see the introductions of things like GDPR in Europe, data privacy laws that are permeating a lot of environments for very good reasons, to protect the well-being of the consumer base. But they're also putting a tremendous amount of pressure on enterprises. The world is getting more complicated. And then we're starting to see the emergence of things like edge computing as being a significant driver of innovation in the industry. When you think about what 5G means, it's not just adding another G, right? It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about connectivity. I mean, how many of you have seen those demos where someone downloads a full movie in a few seconds on a phone, right? It's profoundly changing the way that devices are connected. It's opening incredible new scenarios, and it's driving incredible challenges, not just for the telcos that are trying to deliver the NFV capabilities, both the control plane and data plane capabilities, to support this profoundly different technology set. But it's also creating new opportunities and new challenges for enterprise organizations that are going to be dealing with more intrinsically connected consumers and more intrinsically connected devices. I spend a lot of time talking to retailers that are looking at how to get more computational resource out to the network edge. How can I drive inferencing workloads in my storefront to really drive better experiences for the retail customer? I talk to organizations that are challenged by, how do I construct an autonomous vehicle? How do I get enough computational resource, not just into the vehicle, but out to the edge to serve the vehicle in a meaningful way? And these challenges are, if anything, going to accelerate and create sort of fundamentally new ways of having to think about the organization and management of the computational fleet that drives the business. And of course, we also need to think through bare metal itself. There's a lot of situations where people perhaps want to introduce relatively minimal deployments of Kubernetes, and we need to think through this whole holistically. But for us, being VMware, a lot of this starts with Project Pacific. And one of the core themes you'll see is that the patterns and capabilities that we're introducing into Project Pacific map elegantly into a lot of these other spaces as well. So let me dive into that just a little bit. There's two ways to think about the Project Pacific announcement. How many of you feel like you're experts in what Project Pacific is? Like you really got it? Okay, that is not a lot of hands. It could also be just ashamed to put your hand up, but when we look at Project Pacific, it's really two things, right? Thing one, I've heard about this Kubernetes thing, I want it in my vSphere environment. But I recognize that Kubernetes is a rapid, vital, evolving technology. So I want to be able to deliver it in an ongoing continuous basis, update it, lifecycle manage it, start to consume it in a much more discrete fashion. But it's also answering the question around how can we make vSphere fundamentally better by some of the learnings that have come out of the Kubernetes community. If we map back to that original problem, I have a set of development teams that are intrinsically frustrated by my ability to deliver API-driven infrastructure that meets all of my enterprise conformance and governance requirements. We have to have a more authoritative answer. And it can't be just about Kubernetes and containers. It also needs to expand into the virtual machine space as well. We really need to think through what it means to blend these worlds together. And one of the nice things about Kubernetes, first and foremost, is it has a progressive and very robust API surface area. Why would we not want to bring a lot of those capabilities to vSphere in a way that enables organizations to start to think about mixing those containers and virtual machines together and scheduling them through a single common interface into their vSphere infrastructure? But it also does something else, which I think is also quite profound. When you think about what Linux application containers are, they're really good. Well, not really good. They're okay as a resource isolation framework. But we really haven't cracked the code on pod level security in a meaningful way. There's a very strong appetite for the ability to use more robust security isolation technologies around containers, but also to be able to spin them up in a highly optimal fashion. When you start looking at what Linux does, and Linux as a host for a large number of Linux application containers, it certainly has some benefits in terms of its simplicity and its capabilities, but it also has some deficiencies. I talk to a lot of customers that start their journey with Kubernetes on large vertically scaled single machine instances, and they quickly discover the limitations of Linux to be able to effectively deal with resource allocation across that spectrum. What we've introduced with Project Pacific and the ESX integration and the pod native, sort of pod VMs effectively, is the ability to get the benefits of virtualization in an experience that's optimized for containers. So relatively low startup times, very high levels of resource efficiency, deep optimization through the NUMA capabilities, et cetera. And so it really is bringing together the best of both worlds. And Project Pacific offers the promise of allowing organizations to start thinking about the Kubernetes journey, starting where they are with virtual machines, and over time, gracefully introducing additional capabilities. It also introduces a very necessary separation between the world of Kubernetes consumption, where you can start to think about this rapidly evolving Kubernetes in a far more discrete and far more consumable format, with a set of the core services that ultimately end up supporting it. So I'm incredibly optimistic about the future. And I think it's an incredibly efficient way to start using Kubernetes in a very real way for a lot of our customers. Now, I've sort of spent a little bit of time of talking through the run piece and introduced Project Pacific as one of the planks in the area. But one of the things I also want to kind of point out, and this is sometimes comes as a little bit of a surprise to our customers, is that the way you think you're going to end up consuming Kubernetes is maybe a little different to what you've been told, right? Kubernetes is really great at some things, but it also kind of sucks at some other things, right? The things that Kubernetes is really great at, wow, it's really good at scheduling Linux application containers. Wow, it's a fantastic distributed systems programming model. As development teams start to use Kubernetes, they learn that they're not just writing container packaged applications and writing YAML files, they're also creating custom resource controllers. Those custom resource controllers are effectively programming the Kubernetes control plane. And if you think about this, how many of your developers to trust to program your underlying control plane in the generic case, right? Actual results may vary. And as you start thinking about third-party software that's also extending the Kubernetes control plane, you pretty quickly find yourself in a world where you need more clusters than you thought you needed, right? This is a reasonably consistent theme with a lot of our customers. I can generally tell where someone is in their Kubernetes journey by asking one question. how many Kubernetes clusters do you have right now in production, right? And you might say, like, well, how can you tell anything from that? You know, like, you could stand up a 2,000 node Kubernetes cluster, a dedicated operations team, and carve that out into a set of namespaces and run a pretty significant volume of workloads on it. But the reality is that's not how enterprises are consuming it. The consumption model is, it's not a VM, but it's also not a data center operating system. It's something in between. And as you think about your own journey as you approach these technologies, recognize a couple things. One is, we are working actively in the community to increase the capabilities. This is still a young and evolving technology. It's very powerful, it's absolutely production ready, it creates tremendous outcomes for organizations. But it's also something that will evolve as a point of consolidation from a resource perspective. It's going to be a while before I feel really great about telling organizations, hey, you could just have one Kubernetes cluster. And as a result of that, you have to not just have the ability to deploy and operationalize Kubernetes, you have to have the ability to lifecycle manage it at scale. But you also need to start centralizing some of the pieces that need to be centralized. And that's why we built Tanzu Mission Control. It's intended to really align the operating profile of both developers and the IT teams that support them. And I'd like to invite Aaron on stage to jump into some of the details and talk about the technology. Aaron.
Great, thanks, Greg. So Kubernetes, really brings the promise of consistent operations across multiple clouds. And we are bringing a lot of that to work with Tanzu Run to enable you to have consistent management of cluster lifecycle across environments. However, as Craig has talked about, as many of you start to build more cloud-native applications across more teams, across more clusters, you're bound to face this problem of increased fragmentation. And this has some real downsides, including loss of visibility, loss of control over the fleet of clusters in your organization. And these are the challenges that we're looking to solve with Tanzu Mission Control. Tanzu Mission Control really provides this single control point for organizations to manage Kubernetes clusters across multiple clouds and teams. We're really focused on providing operations teams the right tooling so that they can maintain visibility and control over these environments, but also providing developers the right tooling so that they can move quickly without being encumbered by these restrictions from the operations team. So I want to dig a little bit more into some of the capabilities that we're building out with Tanzu Mission Control. There are two ways that we bring clusters under management with Tanzu Mission Control. The first is that we can deploy clusters directly from Tanzu Mission Control and really drive the underlying Tanzu Run capabilities that Craig spoke about. But what may be even more powerful for a lot of organizations that are still early in their journey is that we can attach any existing Kubernetes cluster, so clusters like OpenShift or EKS or GKE, or maybe your own hand-rolled DIY cluster, into Tanzu Mission Control for not only visibility of those clusters, but also control and management. There's a couple key design principles that I want to mention here that we're really driving into everything that we do with Tanzu Mission Control. The first is extensibility. So we're building an API-driven, extensible solution. We expect you to want to work Tanzu Mission Control into your existing workflows. And we're providing the tooling to help you do that. But for organizations that may not be quite as opinionated, you're earlier in your journey, we also want to provide that easy button, the easy path for you with the right tooling. The second key design principle is open source. As Craig mentioned, we're making huge investments in upstream Kubernetes as well as related projects. And we're bringing and leveraging a lot of that work into everything that we're doing with Tanzu Mission Control. So enough with the slides. Let's actually go ahead and jump into a demo. So I'll be driving this demo from the UI. As I mentioned, this is an API-driven system, and we also have a CLI. So actually, the last time I did this, somebody asked me if this was live. Yes, this is live, so wish me luck. All right. So as an operator, with Tanzu Mission Control, I'm able to see all of the Kubernetes clusters across my organization. As I mentioned, there's two ways to bring these clusters under management. The first is that we can create clusters directly from Tanzu Mission Control, but we can also attach clusters that are being managed elsewhere. So as an operator, say I want to create some additional capacity for my development team. I'm going to go create a new cluster. I'm going to show this on AWS EC2 instances, but we're also building out similar capabilities, as Craig has mentioned, across other public clouds. And we'll also have a similar approach for actually driving Project Pacific in a very similar way. In this implementation, we're really focused on providing the same kind of ease of use that you're going to get with a managed Kubernetes offering, something like EKS, or AKS or GKE, but we're also providing you additional options to configure things under the hood and actually have access to the control plane nodes. I'll give the cluster a name and assign it to a cluster group. So cluster groups enable me to group like sets of clusters that I want to ensure are consistent in their configuration and their security properties. So I'm creating a development cluster. I'll add this to the development cluster group. I have a choice of a single node control plane development cluster or a 3-node control plane production cluster. I'll stick with development here. And lastly, this cluster comes with a default node pool of 1 worker node. These are the nodes that my application will actually be deployed onto. I can easily change the configuration, including the number of nodes in this pool. And I can also add additional node pools. And then I'd hit create, and that's it. And within 6 to 8 minutes, you would see that cluster come online. So I'd also be responsible for ensuring that that cluster is actually healthy over time. So we can see some high-level health information here. It looks healthy. Let's actually dig in and look at some of the details. We can see some metadata about the cluster, some overall utilization information. We can also quickly dig in and see the health of the Kubernetes components, as well as the health of the worker nodes. And if there were an issue here, I could easily go one level deeper and actually look at each of these individual worker nodes of this cluster, and maybe even look into a given node to see those node conditions as well as the pods that are running on the node. Now here we're really focused on this high-level health information that you're going to need across a fleet of clusters. But we will also be integrating with some of the industry-leading monitoring solutions so that when you do want to dig into those metrics, logs, traces across clusters, you can do that. VMware's Wavefront service is one of those services that we will be providing an integration with. So I've created a cluster. I want to actually make sure now that my operations team has access to this cluster. So as I mentioned, I added the cluster to the development cluster group. So let's go see what that looks like. Here's the development cluster group. And here's this development cluster 2 that I just created. So by adding this development cluster to this group, it automatically inherits any policies that we set at that group level. And for those that are earlier in your journey with Kubernetes, this may seem like a relatively simple thing to do, but this is a hugely challenging area for a lot of organizations as they build, grow out the number of Kubernetes clusters. It becomes very challenging to actually go into each single cluster and apply these role bindings individually. Very tedious and manual. So now my operations team has access, but what about the developers? This is what we're all here for anyways, right? So Tanzu Mission Control really takes this application-centric approach. And modern cloud-native applications often run across multiple clusters and oftentimes even multiple clouds for resiliency. Tanzu Mission Control provides a way to create these isolated deployment environments across multiple clusters and ensure that those environments are consistent and secure based on the needs of that application. This concept is called a workspace. So we can see here we have an application called Acme Fitness. We've created a workspace for our dev and staging environments. We can see we have 3 Kubernetes namespaces. And they're all located in 3 different clusters, and these clusters are actually located in different clouds. Now, as an operator, I could go create a new namespace in this new cluster that I just created and provide access to the development team to go deploy their app. But what I'd actually probably want to do is provide the development team the ability to create their own namespace. And by creating their own namespace as part of this workspace, the security and configuration constructs that I've created will apply to that. So it really gives me this ability to provide self-service access to infrastructure for development teams while being able to ensure that those environments are secure. So a lot of what I've talked about with this workspace concept is very focused on policy. But you can imagine where we're going with this. Where this becomes really interesting is actually helping application teams consistently deploy applications across multiple clusters and multiple clouds. So in summary, Tanzu Mission Control really provides you the single control point to manage Kubernetes clusters across clouds. We really automate a lot of the manual processes that organizations are faced with today. And imagine the power of this kind of platform when you're managing thousands of clusters or clusters that are being accessed by tens of thousands of developers. All right, with that, back to Craig.
Thanks, Aaron. All right, well, we can all thank the demo gods that worked out great. Sometimes these live things are tough. So we're painting a pretty significant picture around our futures around Kubernetes. As you think about where we're going, I think it should be pretty clear that VMware is all in on Kubernetes. And we're not just about making Kubernetes accessible to you through your existing data center investments. We really want to take that into every environment that you're going to be interacting with in the future. And we don't believe it's necessary, we believe it's necessary but not sufficient to just deliver Kubernetes. We also have to construct the tools that enable your teams to build the applications that are running in the Kubernetes space. But the question is, how do you get there, right? We've obviously built out a lot of existing technologies. We're moving to this bold future where we continue and invest in the alignment of our build, manage, and run capabilities. But you are here today on your journey, and you need to be able to progress forwards. I see this broadly as an evolutionary path, not a revolutionary path. We're introducing Kubernetes in a natural way into vSphere, that you can consume it. But we're also making sure that it works very well, and it's very naturally integrated into what you're doing with vSphere today, with your existing virtual machines. We have an offering of Kubernetes in the marketplace today called PKS that our customers are seeing a tremendous amount of success with. We're introducing complements to that technology, both in the build and the managed space, but we fully expect to integrate and align those efforts. The investments that we're making in the platform as a service space will be significant and will include, obviously, assuming that the transaction with Pivotal closes. But they will also assume that it's going to be an evolutionary path forwards. We want to preserve the great experiences that our customers are having today and be able to bring them forwards onto these new platforms. So our intent is over the next coming years to make significant investments, bring out bold new products, but every stage of the game be willing to walk the journey with our customers. And that means not just providing a natural evolutionary path forwards for the products that you're already betting on and are running your business on, but also in terms of walking the journey from an experiences perspective. One of the things that I've discovered and that I feel very strongly is that the best products are built in collaboration with customers. And the best outcomes are driven where you're not just delivering a product, but you're delivering a solution. You're investing in the support that a customer needs to up-level their skills to make best use of these capabilities. And so as you look to our future, you will see us not just delivering the technology, but investing significantly in building out the practices you need to be able to consume the technology, the patterns and architectural guidance, and providing supplemental resources that you can bring into your organizations to drive application transformation programs and infrastructure modernization programs. So we are really committed to walking the journey with you and evolving the set of technologies that you're already betting on, versus looking at a revolutionary set of outcomes as you progress down this path. And so wrapping it all up, when we look at the capabilities that our customers need, it does start with an infrastructure portfolio. We have to deliver a set of capabilities that run well on the technologies you're already using. And that's where we're starting with our VMware PKS offering. And we're committed to a future that brings that into the very core of vSphere in a very natural and deeply integrated way. We're committed to solving the problems that emerge as Kubernetes becomes a ubiquitous substrate, not just in one environment, but in many, and bringing those environments together under the capabilities of something like Tanzu Mission Control. We can start to think about a number of different environments as part of a unified infrastructure environment that you can deploy these applications into. And we're committed to a future where we look at not just continuing the great work that Bitnami and Pivotal have done, but accelerating that and make it more naturally aligned with everything else we're doing so we can create great outcomes, not just for the infrastructure teams that are delivering services, but to the development teams that are ultimately consuming them and naturally aligning those worlds. And when I wrap it all up, I tend to think about the set of outcomes that we want to produce for our customers is really grounded in this idea of the modern software supply chain. When I talk to enterprises, they get it, right? They understand supply chain management. I take a set of inputs, I apply a set of processes, I optimize it to reduce the cost. I establish an idea of quality control and provenance at every point of the game, and I deliver a business outcome to my customers. Why aren't we thinking about software the same way? We have an opportunity to start thinking about the way that we manage our teams, the way that we leverage the infrastructure, the way that we manage our vendors, very much in the same way. We have an opportunity to increase the productivity of the teams that are feeding the supply chain, provide them better support and better capabilities, and ultimately start to establish the provenance and trust and deep security along the entirety of the journey. So I could not be more excited to be a part of this journey. I'm really having a lot of fun. And I'm hoping that with the broader Tanzu vision, we'll be able to help your organizations make the step forwards into the next generation infrastructure space. So thank you so much for your time.